Here's a question for you. What is the hardest bird to find in North America? Could it be the California condor, like I thought? Or is there a bird that's even trickier to find? Today, I'm putting Dustin on the spot to find out.
And speaking of birds, what if I told you there's a bird out there with stomach acid so powerful that it can dissolve anthrax, botulism, and even metal? This bird family has the most acidic stomach of any animal in the animal kingdom.
And did you know that scientists are using certain types of birds as high-tech spies to track wildlife epidemics and even poachers? We're diving into all of that, plus some amazing conservation wins in this week's episode of Hike and Hearth TV.
Don't fly off before watching this episode.
So we always start off with me picking Dustin's bird brain on questions that I have about either nature or wildlife or even conservation. And this week, I have a birding question for you that I thought of.
Bring it.
And I think it's a pretty good one. So I know this is going to be a pretty big and broad question to answer, but I was wondering, what is the hardest bird that definitely exists to bird for in North America? What's the hardest one to find if you're a birder?
That's a really hard question because different birds are difficult for different reasons, but it basically hinges on kind of three factors. One is rarity, how many of those birds are out there to be found. One is accessibility, which hinges on habitat and sort of how difficult it is to get to the place where they exist. So, a couple weeks ago, we talked about great gray owls and boreal owls and things like that, which are not as rare as some of the birds that I would put onto this list, but they're tougher to find from a, getting out in 20 degrees below zero habitat kind of thing. And some birds just have super elusive behavior and they're hard to come by, like a northern saw-whet owl. But for this list, I would count the California condor as one of them.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, the condor's, a special bird because it was declared extinct in the wild in the late 80s. It was declared extinct because the last living wild specimen were captured in order to save the species. And today, there's only about 275 wild California condors out there. And so they're really difficult to find, except if you know where they are, which is sort of northern Nevada, southern Utah, and in southwestern California, kind of on the coastal side of California. They're soaring up in the sky. So if you can, even though they're super rare, if you can get to places where you know that they are, you can look up in the sky and hopefully have a good chance of seeing them.
I would love to see one of those someday. Okay, so that had been my guess, and that was kind of the little teaser I had given you before we started recording when I told you that I wanted to cover this question this week. But you also kind of said, yeah, you're kind of right about the California condor, but you felt that there were birds that were actually a better representation of hard birds to find, right?
Yeah, because although the California condor is super rare, you can get to it. Other birds are much more hidden in the forest. So bird number 2 that I would say is maybe the Bicknell's thrush, which is a bird that looks like a hermit thrush or a gray-cheeked thrush, but is sort of an elevation and habitat specialist. I think the Bicknell's thrush was only declared a distinct species of its own in like the 90s or so. So there's a lot of lifelong birders that have never seen the Bicknell's thrush. But if you get up into the mountains in sort of northern New Hampshire, southern Maine, northwestern Maine, like up in that area, you definitely can find a Bicknell's thrush. There's some bird guide companies that are pretty good at finding where they're at.
That's really interesting. So I'm not going to derail our conversation right now, but I think you just uncovered a little rabbit hole for me to dive down, because I'm really surprised that we're still discovering bird species as late as the 1990s. And I think I'm going to research that in my free time this week.
Yeah, I mean, in North America, where we know the species really well, it's not so much as discovering a new species, but discovering that what was previously thought as a subspecies deserves its own entire name and species because it's more uniquely different than we realized, particularly with modern DNA research. So
Interesting.
whereas it might have been called a subspecies of the gray-cheeked thrush in the past, and I'm not even certain of this, so don't quote me. But for example, stuff like that happens all the time where then we discover through DNA that they're actually a unique species, even though they look very much like another. So that's likely the reason for Bicknell's becoming declared a species of its own, even though it had been known prior to that.
So if you stick around till the end of the video, I'm going to mention a new addition to the Hike and Hearth family of content. And I'm going to come back to this at that point. But all right, Bicknell's thrush. What else? Is there anything else that you would describe as a really hard to find bird as a birder?
Yeah, we like a good conservation story. And the Kirtland's warbler is definitely one that was on the endangered species list, I think, for more than 50 years, but was recently delisted maybe in 2019 or so. The Kirtland's warbler is an extreme habitat specialist. They only breed in like northern Michigan and the like northeastern corner of Wisconsin, and specifically only in new jack pine scrublands. So these are trees that are like 5 to 15 years old. So modern practices either allowed those trees to grow up tall or didn't replace them or whatever. So that's a species that has benefited over time from wildfires and things like that. And without common and sort of out of control wildfires these days, they really declined substantially. But they do winter down in the Bahamas as well, so they can be seen over the winter in the Bahamas in similar forests. And if you go to some of the bigger bird festivals in the Midwest, one is called the Biggest Week in American Birding, and they host it at the McGee Marsh Bird Observatory. I think I have that name right. But that's a place where you can go see Kirtland's warblers in like May before they settle into their nesting routine.
I like the name of that event. It sounds big.
It does. It's sort of like the World Series of birding.
That's fun.
But there's some really great conservation organizations that put that on, including the Black Swamp Bird Observatory and the folks at McGee Marsh and Prairie Potholes and places like that that are really well known for their conservation work. To be fair, we didn't talk about the hardest birds being like Asian vagrants that come across from Russia into Alaska, and you have to get up to like Attu on the islands, you know, in northern Alaska. But you only can get to those numbers in a big year if you actively get to all the birds where you know you can find them. So I saw David Sibley speak a couple years ago, and he made a really good point that even when a bird shows up in a rare location, it often will end up in that same rare location a year later or 2 years later. And even though something is rare, its habitat is not random. So sure, if you're a big year birder, you're going to get to the Biggest Week in American Birding because you know you can tick off 30 species of warblers, including half a dozen that would be hard to find any other time.
Okay.
Including the Kirtland's warbler.
Interesting. All right. I have no more questions on my question of the week. What do you think? Are you ready to move on to our featured topic for the week?
That's right. We talked about the California Condor, and our feature topic is going to be vultures.
All right, I am going to kick off this featured topic this week because this is all my fault that we are focusing on this. We actually had a couple other topics that we were considering on covering this week. And then here's what happened, folks. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through TikTok, waiting for dinner to be ready in the oven one night. And I came across a video by an account I think is called Wild Birds. And here's what the video looked like. It was a video of a vulture. I don't think it was a turkey vulture because of the color of the head was different. It was sitting on the railing of someone's deck, and the person was talking in a voiceover. You didn't see them on the screen.
Okay.
And what they were explaining was some of the unique biological adaptations of vultures. And what caught my attention was what they said about stomach acid and just how acidic the stomach acid of a vulture is. And as someone like me who has a background in microbiology, I was fascinated at what that meant for that bird and how that protects that bird when it is eating what it's known for eating, which is decaying matter.
Dead stuff.
So I came to Dustin midweek just a few days ago and said, I want to learn more about the vulture family because I feel like this is a crazy, unique family of birds. And I'm just fascinated and fired up by these animals. And Dustin was kind enough to accommodate us. So on that note, where do you think we should start with this conversation?
I think we should start thinking about what the world looked like 300 or 400 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution in particular.
You just can't stop talking about dinosaur birds, can you?
No, I'm not talking about dinosaur time.
Okay.
But if you think about how much biomass was out there to die and be fed upon, vultures are nature's cleanup crew. And they really thrived when they had stuff like woolly mammoths. And that was more like a, I don't know what woolly.
I was going to say that wasn't 300 years ago, thank God.
No, but woolly mammoths were around at the time of the building of the pyramid. So it's only a few thousand years ago. It's not like prehistoric dinosaur times.
Yeah, you're right.
But even a few hundred years ago, right, there were a lot more elephants, giraffes, really big mammals, and in North America, bison and buffalo and stuff like that that were to be fed on when they died, and not everything survived the march across the American West or whatever. So they would have survived really well. But vultures have, I think, 23 species worldwide. And if you break them down into the ones that are in the Americas, there's only 7 species. And those 7 species are mostly monotypic, meaning each family has a genus, but each genus only has one single species in it. So 5 of the vultures that we have in the Americas are the only one remaining of their family. So there's 7 in the Americas, 5 of them that are individuals in their genuses. And those are basically the turkey vulture you mentioned, the black vulture. The turkey vulture is the only one that has a couple of others in its species, in its genus, which is the greater and lesser yellow-backed vultures. We won't really talk about them. They're down in South America. And the king vulture in South America, the California Condor, and the Andean Condor.
Okay. So can you give us a little bit of an overview of, some of the main vulture species in North America or South America? Like, I'm familiar with the turkey vulture because we have those around here.
We do. And it's migration season already. Today's February 1st. Turkey vultures are early migrants and start showing up usually by about the second week of February.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I didn't realize that they actually migrate. I hadn't really thought about that. But I don't know much about like the black vulture or the king vulture. So like, can you kind of, what's the difference between these 3 species?
Yeah, king vultures are exclusively down in South America, so we don't see them up here.
Okay.
But the turkey vulture and the black vulture are very similar. They look a lot alike, especially because young turkey vultures do not have that red head. In their first year, they have a black head. So they look a lot like a black vulture, which has the black head, but also less. If you see a turkey vulture, they've got white on half of their wing from underneath. The black vultures don't have that. And black vultures have a really short tail, almost comically short, and their head is smaller than a turkey vulture. But they're a cooperative species as well. You might have heard that birds don't have a sense of smell. That appears now to be wrong. That actually David Sibley in this book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, points out that nearly all birds are believed to have a sense of smell at least as good as people have.
Oh, interesting.
But vultures have an even better sense of smell and can smell dead stuff while they're flying about overhead. Probably not from super high, but when they might spot some stuff and start to circle and then use their sense of smell to hone in on the actual dead smell of that carrion that they're going after. But black vultures have a smaller head, therefore a smaller nose. By the way, a turkey vulture has the nose you can see right through its nostrils. That is one of the ways that it is better at smelling, because it has sort of increased airflow passing over its olfactory uh, sensors in its nose. But black vultures don't have it quite as well in the sense of smell department. So they'll often follow the turkey vultures and kind of piggyback off that sense of smell and let the turkey vultures lead them to food.
So for black vultures and turkey vultures, do you know off the top of your head, like where they're located in North America? Like, do we have black vultures around here, or do we only have turkey vultures in New England?
We have both, but here in New England, turkey vultures are much more numerous. Probably, in my experience, 90%, 95% of vultures are turkey vultures, and then the rest of them are black vultures. And if you were to see a large flock of like 30 or 50 birds, you might get one or two black vultures mixed in there.
There's a horse stable up the road from us. And one of the things that I love is every once in a while, I'll be driving down that street on my way to like the grocery store or work or whatever. And there will be a group of turkey vultures just sitting on the fence, watching the cars go by, like just hanging out. I don't even know what you call a group of turkey vultures.
A good point. Maybe just a kettle.
So here's a question from the audience for the audience. If you're watching this and I know a group of crows, for example, is called a murder. If you know what a group of turkey vultures or vultures in general is called, drop it in the comments and let us know, because we don't have the answer to that while we're recording. Okay, so as I mentioned, I do have a background in biology. My specialty was microbiology. And so when I saw that video on TikTok, the stomach acid comment that TikToker made really caught my attention. And it got me to start looking into vultures a little bit more. And like I mentioned, getting Dustin to agree that that would be our next episode for all of you guys. Before we get into Dustin giving us even more information on the biological adaptations of turkey vultures or vultures in general, I thought it would be helpful if I gave a little bit of a quick overview on what pH is. So pH really is a measurement, for anybody who might not remember, of how basic or acidic something is. And the word basic and alkaline are kind of used interchangeably. So pH is measured on a scale of 0 to 14. Neutral is 7. And the best example of something that is neutral in pH that I can give to you guys is water. The extremes of this scale, whether it's alkaline or acidic, it's toxic. We tend to think of acidic as being toxic, but alkaline can absolutely be toxic as well. And sometimes there may be things that we think are acidic that actually are alkaline. So for example, high numbers on the scale, when you start getting up to 14, those are the alkaline numbers. Those are the basics. And examples of that are ammonia or bleach. Those are actually alkaline solutions. If you're low down on the scale, you're dealing with the acidic part of the scale. Examples of that are lemon juice or the sulfuric acid that you find in drain cleaners, for example. So stomach acid is in your stomach to help with your digestion, but very importantly, to also protect animals, including us, from contamination. So human beings, we have a stomach pH of 2. So we're pretty far down on that acidic scale. And what this stomach acid, one of the things that it does is it helps to kill about 99% of the bacteria that it comes in contact with when you eat something. So why do you get food poisoning? you get food poisoning because you've eaten something that has such a high concentration of the bacteria that it overwhelms the stomach acid in your stomach, and your body just can't keep up with it enough to get rid of it. And then everything just runs amok. And we go through all those unpleasant symptoms that we have. So that is what pH is. And that is why one of the reasons your stomach has stomach acid in it. Now, Dustin, how does this relate to vultures?
Well, as I said, they are nature's cleanup crew. So they don't just eat fresh meat. They certainly don't cook their dinner. But they might come upon a carcass that's several days old, that's been baking in the warm sun and is literally rancid meat.
Yum.
And that is where they shine, because they clean that up. They get all of the dietary benefit from it that they possibly can. And they use that stomach acid to really clamp down the bacteria and prevent themselves from getting sick. In addition to that, this is also a piece of sort of convergent evolution across the vultures. And what I mean by convergent evolution is that we mentioned earlier 23 species of vultures, only 7 in the New World, the sort of Americas. The other ones are in Asia and India and Europe and in Africa. They've evolved similarly, but they're not that closely related to the ones that are in North America. They do not have a common ancestor. They've just evolved in similar ways to meet similar niches of eating dead stuff. And so the stomach acid is one of them that's shared across all of the vultures, as is many of them have no feathers on their head, which prevents them from getting like blood and guts like in their feathers and stuff. So having a clean featherless head allows them to eat without making a big mess and stay pretty clean. They actually prevent the spread of disease. And vultures actually possess the lowest pH of any animal in the animal kingdom. It ranges between 0 and 1, which is, I believe, 100 times more concentrated than a human stomach, or even than battery acid. So their stomachs can actually even dissolve metal.
It's crazy. It's really, really nuts. Yeah, so because their stomach acid is so low, it's so powerful in killing contamination. So, I mean, it protects them from things like botulism, anthrax, rabies, cholera, polio. It's amazing. And just as a side note, as a former microbiology geek, there's actually 4 types of anthrax. I'm not going to go into all of them, but the gastrointestinal version of anthrax, which you would ingest, that gives you symptoms like nausea, abdominal pain, fever. You get a loss of appetite, and you get some vomiting. That type of anthrax is treatable, but it does kill about 25 to 60% of individuals who get it. And that metric is from the CDC. And I know it's a wide range, but there's also a wide range of differences in our bodies, our ages, whether we have strong immune systems and all kinds of other stuff that comes into play. The anthrax that scares most people is the version of it where you actually inhale the spores into your body. That is without question the most deadly form. It's often fatal even with treatment. That has nothing to do with stomach acid. So that's just a little side disclaimer.
I had no idea there was more than one kind of
Yeah,
anthrax.
that's getting into your respiratory system and then into your bloodstream that way. So that one is very different. Anthrax is found commonly in soil. It's in land. I mean, it just exists in nature. It is not some like provocatively rare kind of thing. It's just out there, just like botulism is. So the more you know when it comes to the actual contaminations themselves. But Dustin, there's other biological adaptations with these animals, with the vulture family as well, right? And you probably know more about that than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned their bald heads already, which helps them keep clean. But they also have uh, some weird behaviors. One is they can cool themselves by actually urinating on their legs and using the evaporative process to keep themselves cool. So that's their form of sweating, is to pee on themselves or pee down their legs.
I would imagine that their urine also has some acidity to it that might also prevent or kill contamination as well.
Probably does, yeah, because they certainly get bacteria on their feet. That's a good point. I'd read about this in terms of keeping cool, but uh, preventing infection and bacteria is probably a nice side benefit, if not one of the primary reasons for that also.
Interesting. So it's really amazing from a biological standpoint. In my opinion, I feel like, and I'm bird adjacent, I'm not a birder, but I feel like there really aren't any other birds like these that are this highly adapted in this particular way when it comes to contamination.
Yeah, not as highly adapted, but there's definitely some birds that eat dead stuff, but try to get it, a little more fresh than vultures might have to. So, for example, a couple years ago, there was a deer carcass out in our frozen lake at this time of winter. And I was amazed that it only took 3 days and that entire deer carcass was gone. At night, the wolves and the foxes and stuff would come take some bones. And during the day, the ravens and bald eagles and, yes, turkey vultures were here even at that time and were able to get rid of that whole carcass in 3 days, which was pretty impressive.
Dustin did tell me about that when it was going on because I have a little soft spot in my heart for animals. So the stuff like that will stay with me for days and days. But yeah, it's amazing how something like that can kind of service an entire population of species living out in the wild, right?
Yeah, and they have some other interesting adaptations too, which is sort of they fly a little bit differently than most birds. So turkey vultures, if you see them even at a distance, you might notice that they have a dihedral shape, where instead of they're flying with their wings level across one plane, that they've got their wings up in a V shape, where each wing is on its own separate plane. And what that allows them to do is to fly more slowly. And when they start to tip and one side of their wings gets flat, it creates more lift and it goes back and forth. So it allows them to fly more slowly as they're looking for dead stuff and trying to smell for what's down below.
That's interesting that you say that because now that I think about when I see them over the little lake that we live on, you're right. They almost seem to kind of hang in the air and you'll see them kind of going up and down a little bit.
Yeah, and especially kind of wobbling back and forth. It
Yeah.
looks like they're unsteady flyers, but they're actually using that adaptive advantage to fly nice and slowly and explore, look for food in more efficiently.
That's really cool. Okay, so I have another question for you. I feel like this is what we do on these episodes is I just ask questions. So we mentioned the California Condor early on.
Yep.
And then we were talking about turkey vultures. Are vultures and condors in the same family of birds? What makes them different? Why don't we just call it the California vulture or the turkey condor?
Yeah. So, yes, they're in the same family. And I mean that in terms of the taxonomical hierarchy of kingdom, phylum, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. At that bottom part, family, genus, species. The family is the New World vultures. I think it's Cathartidae or something like that. And then inside of that, there are 5 genuses of extant remaining vultures. And those 5 genuses only contain 7 birds total. So 5 of them are the only one in their genus. And the turkey vulture only has 2 others, the greater and the lesser yellow-backed vultures down in South America are in the same genus with them. But the difference is essentially size, that condors have a little different body structure and they're bigger, but they're just the 2 genuses of Andean condor and California condor are just bigger than the vultures that represent the other 5 New World vultures. So all condors are vultures, but not all vultures are condors.
Got it. So I'm I think it's kind of curious, and we hadn't discussed this when we were going over our notes before we started recording, so I hope I don't trip you up with this. New World Vultures. Like, number one, that sounds like a really good band name, but um why are they New World Vultures? Is it because they're exclusively North American birds that we're talking about?
Yes, and when Europeans came to North America for the first time and they found new birds, they started to divide up. And there's some birds are called common, like a common merganser.
Mm-hmm.
That often means that it's common to both the Old World and the New World. Not that it's just numerous or easy to find. It means it's common between multiple regions. And some birds are specifically split up that there's New World, like there's a whole bunch, most of the warblers are New World wood warblers and they don't exist in Europe. And so the vultures are that way. And if you were to look at the taxonomic sequence of vultures, the New World vultures are not actually very closely related to all of the Old World vultures. If you go back to whatever their common ancestor was, they do not share common traits, those common traits with their ancestors. They just each evolved differently down their own path into similar evolutionary niches with the bald head and an acidic stomach and the body structures that they have and the flight structures. And we can see that even with some of our local woodpecker species, the downy woodpecker and the hairy woodpecker that you've seen. They're not that closely related, but they look very similar because they both evolved in the same direction. The same is true with the New World vultures versus the Old World ones.
Okay, so I feel like we talked a little bit about where the California Condor is located in the question of the week. But for vultures in general, let's narrow it down. Let's talk about North American birds, since we live in New England. If I want to go out birding with you and I really want to see a turkey vulture or a black-headed vulture, where should I be going to look for that? I know you talked a little bit about where they're kind of located, but like, are they a forest bird or are they primarily more in meadows? Like, what's the wingspan 411
This is where I was going. Do you remember what habitat you can play them in wingspan and what their food cost is?
I think it was multiple.
That's right. They're not habitat specialists. They'll live across wetland, grassland, forest, all of the above. They do tend to nest far away from people and civilization, but often on cliffs or rocky hillsides or even on the ground or in cavities or abandoned heron nests. They're not great nest builders. They'll take whatever they can find and build their nest there.
So, do you think that makes them easier for a birder who's interested in vultures to find them, or harder because they're located in so many different places?
Easier, but just a little bit more random. You don't just go to a place to look for them. You kind of keep your eye to the sky and see what might be around based off of, weather conditions and if there's dead stuff around, that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. Okay. And then the other thing that I was hoping you could clear up for us is this whole thing around the California condor being extinct. So it's extinct, but they still exist. How does that work?
It was declared extinct in the wild in 1987, maybe. But they started to raise them in captivity and then released those captive birds into a monitored breeding program and released them back into the wild in the early 90s. So they were only technically extinct in the wild for like 5 or 6 years while the work was being done to reintroduce them and rehabituate them. And the reason that so I said earlier, we no longer have big dead stuff all over the place across the continent. So their food source has been greatly reduced over the last several hundred years. Also, their habitat has been reduced. That was another reason. But also they have a super slow breeding life cycle. California condors will only lay one egg, and they will only nest not necessarily every year, and not until they're mature, like 6 or 8 years old. So if you have one successful condor hatchling, it might be 6 or 7 years before it lays a single egg. And big if that egg is successful, it might not lay another egg for 2 or 3 more years. So it's really small. And again, if you remember your wingspan card, they only support, I don't think the California Condor is even on a card unless it's in an expansion pack. But the turkey vulture, I think, only has 2 eggs on the card. It's the same thing.
I actually think the California Condor is on a card because I think I have played it recently, but I don't think that it had any eggs associated with it.
Interesting. Yeah. At most, it would have 1 if it's there. But yeah, 0 or 1.
But, you know, another thing I was thinking about as far as what could be a problem for this family of birds is I would imagine as the U.S. has grown in size from a population of humans standpoint, and we've kind of built more and more land, and more of the wild species have kind of declined a little in numbers, that these birds are also hanging out near highways and roads for roadkill.
Yep.
And I would imagine strikes by cars is probably a big problem for these animals.
It's certainly a major concern. They're also not fast flyers, as we talked about, so they might slowly swoop down, and they're not real nimble to kind of get out of the way of a car. But also they're impacted by the presence of lead when hunters leave deer carcasses behind or things like that. If, without getting graphic, the bullet might not be in the part of the body that the hunter takes for food, but it might have been in the stomach or the entrails or the head or something. And then if the condor or the vulture comes along and then eats that and ingests the lead, so lead poisoning is a serious problem for all of the vultures.
Okay. All right. That's kind of a bummer.
Yes.
But it does sound like they are making efforts to repopulate them. I do think it's interesting, like growing up, and you would hear people talk about extinct birds like the dodo, right? And you think extinct means gone, but it sounds like different distinctions as extinct in the wild versus fully extinct, versus endangered versus threatened, so on and so forth. So I'm assuming the California condor is still an endangered species.
Yeah. Did you know we have an extremely endangered in the wild species living in our house?
No, I didn't.
So we are a family with a pet axolotl.
Oh, yes. That's true. I hadn't put those two things together.
Axolotls are a similar example, extremely endangered in the wild, now down to just a few specific lakes around Mexico City, I believe. But there's millions of them in the pet trade, so they're clearly not extinct, vanished from the planet Earth, right? California condors are much more extinct than axolotls, but that program has brought them back to about 275 individuals in the wild. And most of them are tagged on their wings, so with kind of big numbers. So whether they're in flight, you can see the number on the bottom of their wing, or if they're perched, you can see it folds over the top of their wing, and it's visible there too. So oftentimes, if you do have the opportunity to see a California condor, the tag on the wing will give it away, and you not only can be confident that it was actually a California condor that you saw, but you could then report or go look up the number and get a little bit of the life history of that bird to know how old it was, where it was from, if it's in its home territory or somewhere else.
That's what I was going to ask you, because I forget there was some bird that you had seen and photographed, and it had a band with a number on it, and you had gone on to...
It was a bald eagle, and bald eagles in New England are tracked by the Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife Department, as well as by the federal, I think it falls inside the USGS, the bird banding program. It's a weird combination of things. But yes, it was a bald eagle that I had photographed, and it was about 5 years old when I reported its band, because I had zoomed in on its foot while it was in flight and was able to see the number. And when I reported it, it was the first time at 5 years old that bird had been reported since it was banded in the nest 5 years prior. So it was good to see the citizen science contributing in that case.
Awesome.
And California condors are exactly the same.
That's really cool. All right. I'm glad we covered them. I think they're really exciting birds. I hope I get to see I will say a California condor is probably top of my list of birds that I really want to see at some point. And I'm not an active birder, but I'd travel out west to try to find one of those guys and say hello. Any parting thoughts, or are you ready to move on to the next segment?
I think that's all I got
All right,
for
cool.
vultures.
So our next segment is nature news. So, we, as you know, have spent the entire episode so far touching upon vultures. And speaking of these very interesting birds, we have some very interesting news that we've come across on this particular family of birds. Um, by partnering vultures with artificial intelligence, researchers are now able to protect against animal epidemics and pass on valuable information on the extent of poaching activities.
That's right. There's some GAIA initiatives that are responsible for instituting some connecting some collaborative conservation organizations, and they've got some high-tech early warning signs that they've put into place in order to be able to track environmental changes and even critical ecological incidents.
Yeah, that's really, really neat. And I know you took some notes on this. So what do they, how are they, how do they like connect the AI to the bird? Is it like a tag?
Yeah, so they have little, like, almost little backpacks for birds that track where they go. And I don't know exactly how the AI is paired up with that, um, but they're using it to sort of be able to track uh, poachers and also migration patterns. And if they then can see the migration patterns laid over with, say, for example, the avian flu epidemic, the H5N1 flu right now is traveling around the country, and we have very good numbers of where it is present based off of dead birds. But if we can then use the AI from the location tracking of vultures and things like that, we won't only know where they died possibly, but also where they were beforehand, and if they're spreading it forward in the food chain.
Okay. And so I'm assuming that one of the reasons why researchers have looked at vultures for this is just because of how they interact with other animals and at what point a vulture is going to interact with an animal. So, like, if they start noticing these vultures are coming upon a number of dead animals, that's kind of their uh-oh moment that, oh, wait a minute, there's something going on out there.
Right. And in places where poaching is a serious concern, so not in America, they can use the tracking information from the vultures to understand where the poaching activity had been and know where to focus their efforts, because tracking poachers is a very time intensive and expensive thing to do. So if you know where to look, that really helps.
Yeah, and so as Dustin was saying, I think it's in Africa, right, that they're doing this with a species of vulture over there.
Right.
No, I think that's really, really cool. And one of the things, looking at our notes, that we noticed when we came upon this article of this research going on is that they've fitted more than 130 vultures with transmitters so far. And again, what they're doing is they're using this as an early warning system that recognizes problems and initiates measures quickly. So they can, for example, check a national park for an outbreak of wildlife disease is
Yep.
one of the things they can do.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, new insights are being gained into the birds which are threatened or nearing extinction themselves to hopefully help us stay ahead of the curve with being able to protect those species. So we're expanding our knowledge of how vultures communicate with one another, how they interact with the environment, and how they cooperate and forage for food, as well as their breeding behaviors, which have been tracked, which are tracked across many different species. And they've already developed an AI for ravens to a very advanced stage where the ravens can even patrol the forest and indicate where there are dead wild boars with enormous reliability, apparently. And that technology can also be used to monitor African swine fever in Europe, which has been a problem there.
That's really cool. I love ravens. So, yeah, I think that's really, it's amazing when you think about it that you could actually be using these birds who are making all these observations as they're moving around their ecosystems to kind of warn us of things that are coming on. All right, so that was our first bit of nature news for this week. The second story starts with some bad news. So, grassland birds are in huge decline, and some populations are down as far as 67% since the 1970s, according to the research that we saw in a recent article. But there's some exciting stuff going on in Canada. And Dustin, I can see you've taken some notes on this story. So can you walk us through what you found?
Yeah, so let's start with some species. First of all, the grassland species, which are mostly affected in the U.S., are bobolinks and eastern meadowlark, as well as some of the grassland sparrow species that are out there. There's a bunch of Lincolns and Nelsons and Savannah sparrows and birds like that. But Birds Canada and the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation have launched the Bird Friendliness Index, the BFI pilot program. It's not a BFD, it's a BFI. But they use what's this Bird Friendliness Index is a biodiversity indicator. So it was developed by the Audubon Society and adapted by the Canadian prairies, adapted to Canadian prairies by Birds Canada. And it measures the contributions that farms and ranchers make to bird conservation by sort of incentivizing farmers to take positive actions. And then when the evidence of the effect of those positive actions are then recorded, they actually get a financial incentive in return.
That's really awesome. So it instead of like just slapping down all these rules on ranchers and farmers, they're making them part of the solution and rewarding them for participating. So it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, it's a little bit like carbon offsets, but for bird species and grassland habitat. And grassland habitats are a problem in New England, especially because we've got fewer and fewer farms. Conservation land tends to get grown up into forest instead of managed as grassland. So we need to do things like controlled burns and invasive species management and trimming back the edges of grasslands so that the forest doesn't encroach on them, because there's bird species that really depend on that habitat.
Okay, so that was our nature news for the week. And now we're off to final reminders.
Before we head off to our next adventure, we wanted to take a moment to remind you of our live stream schedule. That's coming up this Thursday at 8 p.m. Lynn and I had a blast the other night playing some Sibley bird trivia and the board game Digital Style Cascadia. We've got a couple of new trivia games planned for you. So check us out at Hike and Hearth TV, and we look forward to seeing you in our stream or on the recording of that. That'll be posted online afterward.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a lot of fun. It got a little silly. It was a total dork alert at certain points, but it was a really good time. And we try to do these every Thursday at 8 p.m., so hopefully you can make it. The other thing I wanted to bring up was, what was that bird again that was just identified in the 90s? Bickwell's thrush?
Bicknell's. Yeah.
Bicknell's thrush. So I'm going to dig into this particular bird. And why am I talking about this? Well, as I alluded to at the start of the vodcast, we have an official new publication on Medium called Hike and Hearth, of course. I posted our first article the other day, and it was a follow-up to last week's vodcast. In last week's vodcast, Dustin at one point was talking about the common loon. And while he was talking about all the traits of this bird, I started thinking, I couldn't think of any other animal that has red eyes like the common loon does. And I happened to comment to that effect in the vodcast, and Dustin pointed out that actually there's a number of birds that have red eyes. And that led me down a rabbit hole. And so I, the non-birder in the relationship, ended up doing some research last week just to figure out what birds have red eyes. And I ended up writing it into an article, and thus our publication on Medium was born. And that is going to be a publication of all of our rabbit holes and tangents and anything else that we want to talk about and don't really have a place to put it. So, yeah, I think I will be investigating this bird this week because I'm really curious as to why wasn't it until the 90s that it actually was identified? What was it that led to it being kind of identified? I'll probably be driving you a little crazy with all the things I find this week that he probably already knows anyways.
Well, the good part about stuff like that is the science is so fresh that there's usually lots of information about
Yeah.
it. So I'm looking forward to learning about it too.
Absolutely. All right. Dustin, anything else you'd like to add so that I stop babbling on?
Just a reminder, you can find our content and photography at hikeandhearth.com as well as Hike and Hearth TV on YouTube. But until then, reminder to all of our friends, keep your eyes on the skies and your heart in the wild.
Bye, everyone.